This is the focus lesson for drawing energy level diagrams. To begin, let's review a diagram from your reading. The diagram we're going to use or review is the one that you see right on your screen. In this diagram, you'll see that some orbitals will have a higher and some will have a lower energy associated with it. You'll also notice that the order does not correspond directly with the energy level orbital. So when n equals 3, you've got 3s, 3p, but then 3d comes above 4s. So you've got a bit of overlap between some of the orbitals, especially as you get higher up in terms of the energy level. So on paper, it isn't easy to predict what the order is. So we're going to learn to draw a diagram called the Aufbau diagram, which will help us to remember the correct order of the orbitals. So you'll see on this screen we've got a number of circles, and all we need to really remember is how to count from 1 to 7, and that the orbitals can be represented by the letters S, P, D, and F. So to begin drawing, we're going to start by numbering from the bottom to the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And we'll notice that there's only 1 1, but 2 2s, 3 3s, 4 4s. And after 4, there's only 4 circles for E. So that means we just have 4 5s, 4 6s, and 4 7s. So the next step is to write in the S, P, D, and F. So S is for the first column, so we're going to give each number the letter S in the first column. Column 2, each number gets a P. Column 3, it gets a D. And then F's for column 4. The next step is to draw arrows. And we will draw the arrows from bottom to top, left to right, through the circles. Okay. And when you end up at the left-hand side, you stop and draw the arrow head, and then continue with the next diagonal arrow. So now your Aufbau diagram is complete, and we're going to use the arrows to help us predict the order. So if we follow the arrows, it'll tell us the order by going through and then getting to the tip of the arrow. And when you get to the tip of the arrow, you then go to the bottom of the next arrow, and you go through that arrow. Get to the tip, bottom of the next one, through that arrow, tip, bottom of the next one, through that arrow, and so on. Okay. So by that, we can see that we start with 1s because we went through 1s first, and then the arrow brought us to 2s, and then to 2p and 3s, and then to 3p and 4s, and so on. So here we see that between the 3s, 3p, 4s, let's add one more, and then we get the 3d. So this was where we had the first overlap, okay? And that's how we can figure out how the 4s comes before the 3d. Okay? So there is evidence experimentally that tells us this, but on paper, when we're predicting, the Aufbau diagram helps us to figure out that 4s comes before 3d. So an important piece to note is that the Aufbau diagram relates to the energies of the orbitals, and it will help us to figure out the order of the orbitals based on the relative energies. We also have to remember a few things when we are drawing energy level diagrams. S orbitals always have one suborbital, p orbitals have 3, d orbitals have 5, and f orbitals have 7. So when we draw them, we're going to use lines to represent each suborbital within the orbital. So one line for S, 3 for P, 5 for D, and 7 for F. And each suborbital will have a maximum of 2 electrons. And we draw the electrons with arrows. So one with an arrow up and one with an arrow down. Okay? That represents the opposite spins, and it also relates to the fact that each orbital wants a maximum of 2 electrons. So let's try an example. The example here we have is to draw the energy level diagram for the chlorine atom. Now we saw from the first diagram that the energy goes from bottom to top, so lowest energy 1, then 2, then 3, from bottom to top. So that's how we're going to draw our diagrams. And the information that we need about chlorine comes from the periodic table. And all we need to know is that chlorine is element number 17, which means it has 17 electrons. Okay? And once we know that, we can then start. So let's start for chlorine. Chlorine has 17 electrons. Okay, so we're going to put those electrons into the orbitals, starting at the bottom with 1s, followed by 2s, then 2p, 3s, and 3p, and so on, and we'll figure out if we need any more. Notice that the 1s has only one line for its one orbital, but p has 3 lines for its 3 suborbitals. And also, we draw it according to the Aufbau diagram where the s's are in one column, the p's are in another column, and so on. So even though they go up, just to have it nicely organized, we'll keep each letter in its own column. So now let's begin putting in the electrons. The first electron goes into 1s, the second also in 1s, and once it's filled with 2, and there are no more orbitals for 1s, then we go on to 2s and put in the next 2 orbitals. The next 2 electrons. And then once 2s is filled, the next one is 2p. And notice that in 2p there's 3 suborbitals, so we put 1 in each suborbital before we pair them up. And notice that I didn't do up, 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 then down, down, down. It doesn't matter whether you start with an up arrow or a down arrow, as long as when you pair it up, then you have the opposite arrow for that second electron. So now that 2p is filled, we'll go to 3s. Okay. And before we go to 3p, let's count to see how many we've got. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So we've got 12, we need 17, 5 more. Those are going to go into 3p. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And notice too that it doesn't matter which suborbital you put it in, as long as you've got the 5 electrons there, and that you start with 1 in each suborbital before you start pairing them up. So that's the energy level diagram for chlorine. Now if you go back to your module, you'll have a few examples to try and check and see if you can use these rules to draw the energy level diagram for chlorine.